Hey everybody, it's Emily, the Crazy Worm Lady. I'm here today with our cocoon only bin. This is the Worm Bin Basics series, and this is taking a look and seeing if we're getting some more hatching. And we're going to talk a little bit today about feeding worm bins. But I wanted to start out and see if we have some more hatching going on. So again, got all my bedding and my stuff that came in the package. Have that all over here. And of course, again, if you guys want to get cocoons from me, all of that information is in the link below. See, cocoon like that is getting darker is getting ready to hatch. But some of these that are a little bit lighter aren't quite as close. But I'm just hoping that we might be able to spot a few more worms today. We did find, what, 3 last week. I'm going to kind of go down in this corner where the banana peels were, because I'm hoping that any hatchlings from 2 weeks ago may be working over to where the food is. I see a few little mites, a few springtails, all good signs of a healthy worm bin. But I'm not immediately seeing hatching from the cocoons over there. But we know there were at least 3 or 4 from last week that are in here somewhere. But the material is a really good moisture level. There's no standing liquid in the bottom, but it is nice and moist, which is what our worms want and need to hatch and to live in. And is that a baby I'm seeing? Right down there, guys, check it out. There's a baby. The baby worms are called wisps. And it does look like there was that other one. So maybe we're gonna still be getting more hatching going on this week. You know, these cocoons like this one are definitely close. So let's dig around a little bit more. I was super excited after last week, so I'm really eager to find a lot more babies. But even if they don't show up this week, that's okay. They all are going to take a little bit of a different amount of time to hatch, depending on when they were laid and if they find the conditions conducive. It does look like the banana peels may have broken down because I'm not really seeing them. And even if there's not worms in here, those banana peels will break down because as they heat up, some of the microbes will work in. But I will look and see if I can find those, see if there's any babies on those. And I'll bring you guys back if I find anything else. Then we'll talk a little bit about properly feeding a worm bin and how you can tell if you fed too much or when it's just the right amount. So I'll dig through here a little bit more and we'll come back and we'll chat. Okay, so right up here by my thumb, there's another freshly born wisp. So there's more and more hatching. And for every wisp you find, I'm sure there's several that you don't see. So even just seeing a few is a really good indication that things are going quite well. There's another little itty bitty wisp right there. The more I dig around, I am spotting a few more babies. So I'm thinking that conditions are just right in here. And the signs that all of these cocoons are getting darker and darker. And check that out, we have another one hatching as we speak here. That is so fantastic. See that little guy working his way out? So these worms are telling us that everything is good in here. So all the signs, there's not really any pests in here, but a cocoon like this probably has another week or so before it will darken up and hatch for us. But I can't stop looking around because every handful I'm pulling up, I'm finding new things. There we go. Another light pink wisp down there. But the amount of life in here, as far as like the springtails and the mites and all, there's very few, but they are an indication that this is a very, very much living bedding, and so that this is going to be great for the worms to hatch and live in. So I'm going to finish up going through this, and then we will finish up and call it a day. Found a little sweet spot down here. There's several wisps. But I think that's going to be it for today, guys, and we are going to finish up talking about feeding a worm bin, and hopefully next week this thing's going to be loaded down with more and more babies. Thank you guys so much for joining me again today for another update on our worm bin basics on our cocoon bin. I wanted to talk a little bit today about feeding your bin. The biggest mistake I think most newcomers make at least once is overfeeding your bin. I know we're all super eager to have our worms processing all of our scraps right away, but that's just not feasible. The worms are not going to be able to go through everything as quickly as we may like. So there's a few practices that you can put into place to make sure that you don't overfeed your bin and you set your bin up for success. So the most common method, which is a really fantastic one to kind of get into the habit of doing, is called the pocket feeding method. So say you have a square bin like this. You basically split it up into 4 corners. So there's 4 square pockets that you're going to be feeding. And what you do is that very first week, say you have 1,000 worms. We won't even talk about cocoons right now, but say you have 1,000 worms. If you have 1,000 worms, maybe you'd start with half a cup of food. You take that half a cup of food, you put it in that first corner, you bury it up with your bedding source, and you leave it be for a week. The second week you come in and you feed your second pocket. You want to peek at that first pocket. Hopefully the worms have moved in, they're starting to break it down, and that way, you're seeing that the worms are starting to process the food. So you feed pocket number 2. You come back your third week, you go to feed your third pocket. You want to go back and check those first 2 pockets and make sure that the food has been processed. So that first pocket, all of the food should be gone. The second pocket, again, the worms should have moved into and are starting to work on. But if it's not completely gone, that's okay. But say you get to that first pocket and there's still unprocessed food. What do? You skip a week of feeding. So that way you give it another week, you come back, hopefully that first pocket, the food is gone, then your second pocket is being processed. Now you know it's safe to feed your third pocket. And you kind of go around in this clockwise fashion, and the longer you go through this, you figure out how quickly your worms will process the food. So say they've processed everything by the time you go to do your second pocket that second week. Well, then now maybe you can up your feeding a little bit. Maybe instead of a half a cup of food, you'll put in 3/4 of a cup of food or a whole cup of food. And as you go through this a few times, you figure it out. And that way you know that you're not having too much food in your bin, because too much food in your bin, if it's breaking down too rapidly but the worms aren't moving into it quickly enough, you're going to end up with an acidic issue. It could become anaerobic because all that water from those food scraps breaking down is being released into your bin, and the worms aren't getting in fast enough. So it's really important to kind of hold yourself back and feed slowly and figure out what amount of food is safe. There's the misconception that worms can eat their entire, body weight a day in food. That would mean that 1,000 worms, which is roughly a pound, could eat a whole pound of food a day. And that's just not feasible. I've never personally seen worms be able to do that. So, as much as we want it to be that way, we can't just expect it to be that way and throw in a pound of food our very first week. and expect the bin to survive and thrive. Very likely that would end up being problematic. So do that process for a little while, get the system down, and hopefully then you'll feel very confident in feeding your worms and knowing that they're going to be able to process the food. I don't always do this system completely. I kind of do my own variation on it. Sometimes I'll feed one side of my bin and then I'll feed the other side of the bin. But I did start out doing the pocket feeding method, and that's how I learned how much my worms can handle. So at least to start out with, it's definitely a best practice, a best way to learn to make sure that your bin's going to be successful and you're not going to end up with problems. The other big thing is how do I feed my food? Do I just throw in the scraps whole? Do I need to freeze them? I hear you can blend them. How exactly is the right way to feed your worms? I would say there really isn't a right or a wrong way, but I will talk about the 3 different ways you can feed your worms. First of all, you can throw in scraps whole. And, right off your dinner plate, right off of the counter after you finish a banana, you can throw that peel right in. However, there are some fruit fly larvae, things like that, that live inside of the skins of our fruits and vegetables. So sometimes that could mean that fruit flies could hatch in your bin. So you need to make sure that those scraps are buried up really well anytime you feed. Always make sure the scraps are covered up really well, then that you add a little bit of a grit source and a buffer. So, crushed eggshells kind of work as a buffer and a grit source, something like that. And that would work just fine. However, I personally like to freeze my scraps, thaw them out, and then feed them. The benefit to this is that if you freeze your scraps for 48 hours, at least 48 hours, it kills off most of those larvae. That way you have a lower chance or lower probability of ending up with any sort of, overabundance of pests in your bin. Remember, the bin's an ecosystem, so it's okay to have some pests, but you want to keep it to a minimum. So freezing for me has been huge. I personally really like doing that, but again, not necessary. When it comes to blending is okay, but it can pose its own problems. I blend periodically for some of my experiments, but in general, I don't think it's the best way to feed your worms. And that's simply because if you have your food in a blender, you usually need to add some water in order to get kind of the smoothie effect and to get the food to completely blend up. So that means that, say you're feeding a half a cup of some chopped up scraps. If you're feeding a half a cup of blended scraps, because it was broken down into such smaller pieces, you're feeding a lot more in that half a cup. Even though it's still a half a cup, it's a lot more food and it's a lot more water. So you need to be careful if you're going to do this and really monitor. Again, maybe feed a little bit less if you're going to feed blended food. And, keep in mind it is using electricity. It is kind of not necessary to do. So if you don't want to, if you don't have a blender, certainly don't go out and buy one just for your worms, because it just doesn't have to be done. You notice today we have a lot more wisps hatching in our bin. I can't even find the banana peels that we started with to create our living bedding. But I didn't feed, and I didn't feed because the conditions right now in the bin are great. The cocoons are hatching, so the worms are happy. The cocoons won't hatch if the conditions aren't perfect. So since we have such a good balance right now, why would I risk throwing that off by feeding more too soon? And to me, too soon is if I don't have a whole lot of worms to be feeding to begin with. So next week we'll come back. Maybe there will be even more worms. Some of those initial wisps will be a little bit larger, and maybe I'll feed a little bit. But by a little bit, I might only feed another small piece of banana or a teaspoon of, something blended. But again, you want to start really small and make sure your worms, your wisps, whatever, are processing all of that food before you go and feed again. So bedding is always a food. So you can never, there's no such thing as adding too much bedding. So if you really feel like you want to feed the bin, that's fine. Just add some shredded cardboard, make sure it's, moistened down, or, coconut coir, whatever you're using, that's fine. But, always just err on the side of caution. And keep in mind that surface area is really important. So that's why a lot of people think the blending method is so great, because when you pulverize this food down to nothing, there's so many microparticles the microbes can work right into, that surface area is so vast in comparison to putting an entire banana peel into their bin. And, you know, yes, in theory that's correct, but a lot of times just chopping your food is already going to be expanding the surface area. Not on the exponential scale, but it's still definitely increasing the surface area. So, you know, start out small, don't overthink it, practice some pocket feeding, and I think you'll do just fine. So let me know what you think, guys. It was a great update today. I'm really excited that we got to see another wisp hatching. It's always an exciting thing to see. I think before long we're going to have adult worms, and they'll be laying cocoons of their own. It'll be really exciting to follow along. Next week we'll talk about another topic, take a peek in on the bin. But I wanted to just thank you guys for coming along on this journey with me. I appreciate all of your questions, your comments, your observations. Subscribe to my channel. Feel free to share out this video to anybody you think might benefit from it. And I'll be back with you guys real soon for an update. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you have a great day.